Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Art with Miss Hamadi. Today, we are going to be learning how to create an artwork inspired by Claude Monet. So the tools that we are going to need is a green coloring pencil, a paintbrush, a cup of water, some masking tape or paper tape, watercolor paper, of course, watercolors. Now I'm using two watercolor papers, one to do my testings on and one for my actual artwork. Now there are many different types of paintbrushes we can use. I am using the number 10 paintbrush. You could use, these might be some of the paintbrushes that you have at home, a smaller one, different size, different shapes. All of these are acceptable. I would actually use a larger paintbrush because the bristles would absorb more water and it would spread more water on our paper. Now, before we start, there are a few things we need to understand about working with paintbrushes or painting in general. You should always try to make sure that your paintbrushes are clean. So you don't want a lot of paint on your paintbrushes for a long period of time. Fair enough, watercolors, you'll be able to remove it, but with acrylics, it won't work. You shouldn't leave your paintbrush in water for a long time as well. This ruins the bristles, it will bend it, and it could cause the metal part or the wooden part of your paintbrush to break off. So these are just simple steps that you can take to making sure that your tools are there with you for a long period of time. And let's get started. So I've got two watercolor papers, like I said, one to work on and one to do testings on. The first thing I am going to do is tape down my work onto my table, actually, or the surface that I'm working on. Now, if you don't have paper tape, then of course you could just draw out a border to work on. But the great thing about paper tape is that once you stick it onto your watercolor paper, you paint around it, it will peel off into a very clean line. So while you're taping it down, make sure that it is on a nice flat surface and make sure that your lines will be parallel as well. So I'm just going to open my tape up, bring it down, make sure my paper is flat. I'm going to try my best to keep the dimensions the same. I reckon this is 1 centimeter. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. Now, paper tape or masking tape does not absorb water or the paint. You can just paint right on it and it will work just fine. So I'm just going to continue this last side and we can start painting our work. All right, so we are ready to begin. I'm using these type of watercolors. This is the Sakura Koi watercolors. They're actually one of my favorites. Comes in a huge range of colors and they're very pigmented as well. Of course, you can use the tube kind. This pack actually comes with a paintbrush that you can fill it with water, but I'm just going to use this regular paintbrush. It works just as well. For this project, we are only going to use one paintbrush. Make sure that it is a bit larger so that you can spread water across your page easily. So the first thing we are going to do is we're going to draw out the water lilies on our page. You can do this at random. Actually, I'm just going to show you how to draw it, the overall shape. So you're going to go round, curve, and back. So that's one water lily. And again, round. Oops. Of course, make sure your pencils are nice and sharpened before you start so that you don't have to deal with your pencils breaking. All right, let's continue. Round curve. Then we could go the opposite way. So you can do variations. Be creative with this. Whatever it is that you would like to do, it's acceptable. This is your expression. This art movement is Impressionism. It's all about being able to create art quickly, whatever your impression of that moment in time. This is how Claude Monet intended to paint during this art movement. He had his easel up, he felt what he felt, and he painted that. The Water Lily series that he created later on in his life was actually based on his beautiful garden in Giverny. He had a house there. That's where he moved to with his family. It's in the northern part of France, and he was just very inspired by the landscape. Of course, the next thing we should do is to draw out a water lily themselves. So you can start off by small curves and then build up the curves. Of course, you can draw with a little bit more space between the petals. This will make it a little bit easier for you to draw. But for here, I'm just going to create smaller ones because they are in the background. I think we can add one more small water lily here. And we can start to create the water lilies on the foreground, or the water lilies that are closer to us. Towards the front, I'm actually going to draw the water lily pads a little bit bigger so that we can understand the depth and the space. Of course, the further something goes from us, it will be smaller. I'm going to, of course, make my water lily a little bit larger in front as well. Work with the shapes, finish off the back petals, maybe add one more large water lily pad. And there we go. I reckon we are ready to color or paint in. You can go ahead and, of course, use whatever medium it is you would like to use, but for this project, it will be nice to start painting. There are multiple ways of painting with watercolors. You can do wet on wet, which means you put a water wash, then like I'm doing right now, just add pigment or color onto that. This will make it easier for you to spread the water across or the paint across your page. You could do wet on dry, which is a method of just dipping your paintbrush in the water into the paint and painting it onto a dry canvas or page. Now, this method, of course, you would get more pigment in your work, but it might be a little bit difficult to spread the color across the page. So with watercolors, it's very temperamental. Find a ratio of water to paint that works for you, but I would suggest don't overdo it with the water because you will rip your page. So the ranges of colors that I'm going to use is mostly my blues, greens, maybe some reds. I'm going to test out the blue that I like. I like this bright blue over here. I'm going to use this as a base for my paint. You can, of course, start with the undertone of the water as well. These are colors that make the water murky or darker, and it gives depth to your work. So you can go ahead. I'm actually going to start with adding a very, very light water wash, then choosing the colors I'd like to work with. I'm going to start with a base of yellow in areas where it seems like the light is touching the surface of the water. So I'm going to find a nice yellow. If it's a little too bright, of course, you can just dip your paintbrush in the water and then mix it out a little bit so that you get a nice light color. So I'm going to start light. I'm working with the wet on dry method for the first part over here, adding yellow to the areas where I feel like the sun reflected off the water. So if you go a little bit dark, you just clean your paintbrush. You have to work very quick. And this is the great reason of working with watercolors on this project, because we have to work quick. With watercolors, they tend to dry quickly, and it becomes very difficult to spread out your colors afterwards. So just work with whatever it is that you are feeling, wherever it is you feel would need some brightness, add the yellow. If not, then leave that blank so that we could move on to building our depth in the water. So I'm just going to continue with creating small, thin, but very visible brush strokes with the colors that I'm using. You don't have to be super perfect with blending your colors. This is actually one of the characteristics of Impressionism paintings in general. Artists at that time would use very small, visible brush strokes, meaning that their painting was done very quickly. So we should try to adapt that into our painting as well. Now, other characteristics of Impressionism art is the emphasis on accurately depicting light, which is what we're doing now. Being able to express how light reflects off water or how light reflects off a leaf on a tree. Even though the overall artworks during this art movement was not as detailed, we were able to see and visually capture and also feel the contrast between lightness to darkness, which was a reflection of how the artists wanted to emphasize on the depiction of light and the way it changes over time. Now, the reason why this art movement became popular, actually, it didn't start popular, but artists like Claude Monet, Pissarro, Renoir, they all joined together and they wanted to introduce a new movement of art. And they discussed this amongst themselves and eventually created Impressionism, or this art movement. The way it broke away from the traditional mindsets of what art is was the reason why it became popular eventually. People were not interested in this art movement because before that, we'd see a lot of art with very specific details, and the fact that now they're moving into creating quick art with very small yet thin, visible, quick brush strokes done quickly, people were uncomfortable with that. But eventually, their aim was to capture the movement of life as it is, rather than life as opposed to a stage scene. So it became very popular. Now, as you can see, I am adding blues to my work with very light brush strokes, continuously dipping my brush into the water, dabbing it off into my tissue, into the paint again. Wherever it is that I feel I added too much paint, I'll quickly rinse off my paintbrush, dab it on the tissue, and bring the water to blend out my work. I'm going to continue this process throughout until I am done with the water, and then we can start coloring in our painting in the lily pads and move on to completing our work. Now for here, I'm actually observing the areas where I'd like to be a little bit darker. So the areas where it's underneath the lily pad, I'm actually adding, that's where I'm starting my pigment or adding most of my blues and just spreading the paint across around. We will add some reds to deepen the color down a little bit, but for this part, I'm just going to continue with the process of adding blues and blending it across. So as I'm finishing this off, let's talk a little bit more about Claude Monet himself. He was a French painter, born in November 14th, 1840, in Paris. He was actually best known for his landscape paintings because he rejected the traditional approach to the way that landscapes were being painted during that time with the immense details. He wanted to go the opposite way. Monet actually had an interest in art at a very, very young age. He developed his passion over time by starting his art career with drawing caricatures, and then he was actually encouraged by his father to paint. So that's when he picked up his paintbrush and started his art career in painting. He actually eventually moved on to studying art at the Swiss Academy in Paris, but he had to cut his studies short to join the military. Now, Claude Monet actually got very ill during his time in the military, so he was returned back to Paris, and that is when he eventually built up his arts career again by meeting up with other artists and then eventually building or starting this art movement called Impressionism. Now, the next thing we are going to do is add a little bit of red into the water itself to reflect the lily pads. This might seem odd to you, but this actually creates a lot of depth and creates a natural shadowing effect. So with a very light brush stroke, very, very little pigment, I'm just going to test out the areas I'd like to use. I'm going to start off with underneath, right underneath the lily pads themselves. Start with don't go crazy with the amount of pigment you're using, build on it. So find the right shade that you'd like to work with. I think I can go a little bit darker with my next lily pad. Right underneath there. It's almost as if we're outlining it, but of course not all the way around. Once you've done that, you can clean your paintbrush with a clean brush, just blend it out to soften the lines. Then we're going to continue this across. So at this point I waited for my paint to dry just a little bit and we can start painting the lily pads. Now the lily pads, I'm actually going to create an undertone for it with the same yellow that I've been using. I am going to paint out with my wet on dry method. Just add a nice undertone or a base color to my lily pads so that our green will stand out. They don't all have to be the same value in color. Some may be lighter, some may be darker. It's all okay. I'm just going to continue this across all my lily pads so that we can have a nice undertone to work with. Now after this is done, I'm actually going to leave it to dry just a little bit before adding my greens. Of course, the next step is to add my greens so I can, while I'm waiting, test out the different greens I'd like to use. Maybe use a more cooler green to work with, and then just go with it. Now that, of course, the lily pads that's further away from me, I'm going to try to make it a little bit darker so that I can achieve some depth within my work. I'm just going to add a little bit more of a dark green, alternate between different greens, test them out. I really like this almost olive green that we can work with. This is going to add some more of a dimension to our lily pads. And we're just going to continue this across every single lily pad, outlining almost with a darker green that we're working with. Blend it out. You can clean your paintbrush, dip it into a lighter green for more pigment, and work across this way. I would, at this point, our paper contains a lot of water already. Unless you really wait until it dries completely and then start painting the lily pads, then you don't need to add too much water. Just alternate between cleaning your brush and using a darker green, using a little bit of water, clean it off, and blending it again. Now for the water lilies, all we're going to do is take some red paint on the tip of your paintbrush, outline one side of the petal that you've painted. Of course, you're going to try to work quick while doing this. You can, of course, let's continue on to all of them. You can go ahead and rinse your paintbrush, dab it off. And now we're going to gently blend the lines together with the remaining of the water that's in the paintbrush, just to soften the lines up. This should create a nice little depth of color, a contrast between the sides of the petal. You have a nice little water lily. Now I'm just going to continue painting the rest of my lily pads, again alternating between the lighter green that I'm using, or the olive green, and the darker green for depth. Work fast, cover the areas. We already painted the undertones, so wherever it is that you feel is a lighter part of your lily pad, or the areas that contain a lot of light, that is where you're going to leave a little brighter. And then on the other side, that is where you're going to add depth by adding the darker green. For the final touches, I'm going to try out another bright blue and go over the areas where we added some depth with the red to tone down the redness a little bit. Short brush strokes going across. Keep painting with one single direction. Go across horizontally. This is actually going to help create the ripples on the water, or the effect of that at least. Alternate between some colors. I'm actually going to blend this out a little bit. You can define sides by adding some darker blues on the areas where there are not a lot of contrast. And of course, blending it out a little. And there we go, we've created our Monet inspired water lily painting. I'm going to set this aside for a while and come back to it once it has dried to remove the tape. Please be patient. If you start removing the tape now when your page is still wet, there is a big chance that you are going to rip your entire painting. So now that my painting is nice and dried off, I am ready to peel my tape off. In one single motion across, peel it very carefully. If you rip your tape, you will rip your paper. So just be careful with this. Take your time. Try not to place your hands on your artwork. And we can start to see that we managed to create a very, very clean border around our work.
and it just looks really neat and impressive. This is actually my favorite part of creating an artwork in general. I really like using masking tape, especially when I paint, because of this exact fact. So there we go. We've created our painting. It's nice and neat. I really hope that you all have learned something new. See you all in the next video.